Are you serious? President Vladimir Putin is speaking at a news conference about Syria. Let's listen in live.
We have seen a split of opinions on Syria at this summit. How far can these political disagreements and disparities affect economic relations in the future? And how do you see the prospects of U.S. or Russian-Western relations in the future? You know, everything that's going on in the Middle East affects the global economy very strongly, because this is a region that brings a substantial share of oil resources to the global table. And as soon as there is a turmoil or a crisis in the Middle East, you see oil prices spike globally. And of course, that holds back economic development. Of course, in a difficult period for the global economy such as this, destabilizing the Middle East is counterproductive, to say the least. Indeed, yesterday we spent the entire evening discussing the issue of Syria and all the related issues. We spoke a lot about it. We only closed at about 1 a.m. Moscow time, and then we had also a bilateral meeting with Mr. Cameron until 3 a.m. in the morning. You said there was an equal split, a 50-50 split on Syria here at the forum, but that is not exactly so. I can say that the United States, Turkey, Canada, Saudi Arabia, and France were in favor of a military operation against Syria. We also know that the British Prime Minister, Mr. Cameron, was also in favor, but the British Parliament said no.
Wow.
The General Federal Chancellor has also been very reserved, and Germany is not going to undertake any military action. In the meantime, Russia, China, India, Indonesia, this is the largest Muslim nation, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, Italy, all these nations have been opposed to the notion of a military operation. And even UN Secretary General also spoke against such a military operation. And let's not forget the address of the Pope, who said directly that it would be unacceptable to have a new war of hostilities in that country. I have enumerated the nations that are in favor of expanding the military conflict in Syria by these military strikes. But the latest social public opinion surveys show that even in these countries, the majority of the population are on our side. They are opposed to the idea of waging a new war in Syria. In Europe and the United States, up to 60% of the citizens are opposed to the notion of this war. And once again, I can tell you that the entire case, this entire affair with the alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria was a frame-up staged by the insurgents who hoped to provoke a foreign military operation. That was the whole purpose of this frame-up.
All right,
that's number one. Secondly, I would like to remind you that using military force against a sovereign nation is only allowed if it is self-defense, which it is not for the United States. And secondly, in case there is a mandate of the UN Security Council. As one of the participants of our discussion said yesterday, those who act differently would become outlaws themselves.
Now that is actually live. You're hearing it as he was saying it. He's calling that those who do this, those who get outside the United Nations Security Council and make an attack on Syria would be outlaws themselves. Speaking of course, the United States of America was his reference. Now he did mention several countries that are for attacking Syria, and he mentioned several countries that are against. If I can remember, I heard him say United States, Turkey, and Canada, and then he said a couple more countries. I'll have to go back and watch this YouTube video as you are to remember what those other two were. But basically what I'm hearing is 5 nations are for attacking Syria. and maybe there's 20 nations there. He didn't name the other 15, but he named a pretty significant amount of them are against it. Obviously, Vladimir Putin believes that the chemical weapons used were not done by Assad, but in his mind were done by the opposition, or the Islamic extremist group of that, which would be Al-Qaeda, freedom fighters that are fighting alongside Muslim Brotherhood freedom fighters, and it's coming from that camp in his mind. Now, the President of the United States, who will be speaking later today, and I'm going to cover it live when he does on my radio show, so don't miss it. I'm sure he has a different perspective and has a different agenda. As I just did a YouTube video a moment ago, breaking news, America has ordered all of its essential personnel and non-emergency personnel out of the embassy in Lebanon. They're almost closing the embassy down. And that sounds like a strike is coming. They even told the embassy workers in Turkey, if you'd like to go home, you can too, but we're not closing the embassy. And also, the United States announced late last night that they were expanding their military options as it relates to Syria from not only 200 Tomahawk missiles to be fired from 5 destroyers there in the Mediterranean, but also bringing in B-2 and B-52 stealth bombers to help in the campaign. I see this as a major ramping up, and so we're going to have to wait and see what develops. So that was live. That was Vladimir Putin as he was answering questions to him about Syria. I just happened to glance and see it was live. I just flicked it on and turned on this YouTube video. You heard it just as I did, and he's continuing to talk right now, but that was the gist of it right there. I'll be right back with more YouTube videos, and don't miss today's broadcast. It will be powerful. It may be prophetic, as we're looking at the destruction of Damascus, prophesied in the Bible, in Isaiah 17, verse 1, and in Jeremiah 49, verses 23 through 27. Also, there's some other scriptures that talks about some devastation in the region, but it does talk about this confusing spirit of the drinking of the wrath from the cup of the wine of the cup of God, the wrath of the wine of God, and that's in Jeremiah 25, and I see that as being, that's certainly working among many nations. I'll be right back. Give your life to Jesus. Let's go live. President Barack Obama is now giving his press conference at the G20. Let's hear what he's got to say about Syria.
Use of chemical weapons threatens its neighbors: Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Israel. It threatens to further destabilize the Middle East. It increases the risk that these weapons will fall into the hands of terrorist groups. But more broadly, it threatens to unravel the international norm against chemical weapons embraced by 189 nations, and those nations represent 98% of the world's people. Failing to respond to this breach of this international norm would send a signal to rogue nations, authoritarian regimes, and terrorist organizations that they can develop and use weapons of mass destruction and not pay a consequence. And that's not the world that we want to live in. This is why nations around the world have condemned Syria for this attack and called for action. I've been encouraged by discussions with my fellow leaders this week. There is a growing recognition that the world cannot stand idly by. And here in St. Petersburg, leaders from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East have come together to say that the international norm against the use of chemical weapons must be upheld, and that the Assad regime used these weapons on its own people, and that as a consequence, there needs to be a strong response. The Arab League foreign ministers have said the Assad regime is responsible and called for deterrent and necessary measures against the culprits of this crime. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, its General Secretariat, has called the attack a blatant affront to all religious and moral values and a deliberate disregard of international laws and norms, which requires a decisive action. So in the coming days, I'll continue to consult with my fellow leaders around the world, and I will continue to consult with Congress. And I will make the best case that I can to the American people as well as to the international community for taking necessary and appropriate action. and I intend to address the American people from the White House on Tuesday. The kind of world we live in and our ability to deter this kind of outrageous behavior is going to depend on the decisions that we make in the days ahead. And I'm confident that if we deliberate carefully and we choose wisely and embrace our responsibilities, we can meet the challenges of this moment as well as those in the days ahead. So with that, let me take some questions. I've got my handy list, and I will start with Julie Pace from AFI.
All right, let's see how it goes right here.
Thank you, Mr. President. You mentioned the number of countries that have condemned the use of chemical weapons, but your advisors also say you're leaving this summit with a strong number of countries backing your call for military action. President Putin just a short time ago indicated it may only be a handful of countries, including France, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. Can you tell us publicly what countries are backing your call for military action, and did you change any minds here? President Putin also mentioned you're meeting with him earlier today. Can you tell us how that came about, and did you discuss both Syria and Edward Snowden? Thank you.
Let's see if he picks the same nations. Canada,
I believe that there will be a statement issued later this evening,
Turkey,
although hopefully in time for you guys to file back home,
Saudi Arabia,
that indicates some of the additional countries that are making public statements.
and France, and of course
Last
the
night we
United
had a good
States.
discussion, and I want to give President Putin credit that he facilitated, I think, a full airing of views on the issue. And here's how I would describe it, without giving the details or betraying the confidence of those who were speaking within the confines of the dinner. It was unanimous that chemical weapons were used, a unanimous conclusion that chemical weapons were used in Syria.
Okay, but who did it?
There was a unanimous view that the norm against using chemical weapons has to be maintained, that these weapons were banned for a reason, and that the international community has to take those norms seriously. I would say that the majority of the room is comfortable with our conclusion that the Assad government, was responsible for their use.
Yeah, but that isn't what
Obviously,
Putin.
this is disputed by
Putin.
President Putin.
Yeah, Putin says the
But
majority are with him, and Obama says the majority
If
are with him.
you polled the leaders last night, I am confident that you get a majority who said it is most likely, we are pretty confident, that the Assad regime used it.
The world is split in half.
Where there is a division has to do with the United Nations. There are a number of countries that, just as a matter of principle, believe that if military action is to be taken, it needs to go through the UN Security Council. There are others, and I put myself in this camp, as somebody who's a strong supporter of the United Nations, who very much appreciates the courage of the investigators who've gone in, and looks forward to seeing the UN report, because I think we should try to get more information, not less, in this situation. It is my view, and a view that was shared by a number of people in the room, that given Security Council paralysis on this issue, if we are serious about upholding a ban on chemical weapons use, then an international response is required, and that will not come through Security Council action. And that's where I think the division comes from. And I respect those who are concerned about setting precedents of action outside of a UN Security Council resolution. I would greatly prefer working through multilateral channels and through the United Nations to get this done. But ultimately, what I believe in even more deeply, because I think that the security of the world and my particular task, looking out for the national security of the United States, requires that when there's a breach this brazen of a norm this important, and the international community is paralyzed and frozen and doesn't act, then that norm begins to unravel. And if that norm unravels, then other norms and prohibitions start unraveling. And that makes for a more dangerous world. And that then requires even more difficult choices and more difficult responses in the future. Over 1,400 people were gassed. Over 400 of them were children. This is not something we've fabricated. This is not something that we are using as an excuse for military action. As I said last night, I was elected to end wars, not start them. I've spent the last 4.5 years doing everything I can to reduce our reliance on military power as a means of meeting our international obligations and protecting the American people. But what I also know is that there are times where we have to make hard choices if we're going to stand up for the things that we care about. And I believe that this is one of those times. And if we end up using the UN Security Council not as a means of enforcing international norms and international law, but rather as a barrier to acting on behalf of international norms and international law, then I think people rightly are going to be pretty skeptical about the system and whether it can work to protect those children that we saw in those videos. And sometimes the further we get from the horrors of that, the easier it is to rationalize not making tough choices. And I understand that. This is not convenient. This is not something that I think a lot of folks around the world find an appetizing set of choices. But the question is, do these norms mean something? And if we're not acting, what does that say? If we're just issuing another statement of condemnation, if we're passing resolutions saying, wasn't that terrible? If people who, decry international inaction in Rwanda and say how terrible it is that there are these human rights violations that take place around the world, and why aren't we doing something about it? And they always look to the United States. Why isn't the United States doing something about this, the most powerful nation on earth? Why are you allowing these terrible things to happen? And then, if the international community turns around when we're saying it's time to take some responsibility and says, well, hold on a second, we're not sure, that erodes our ability to maintain the kind of norms that we're looking at. Now, I know that was a lengthy answer, and you had a second part of your question. The conversation I had with President Putin was on the margins of the plenary session, and it was a candid and constructive conversation, which characterizes my relationship with him. I know, as I've said before, everybody's always trying to look for body language and all that, but the truth of the matter is that my interactions with him tend to be very straightforward. We discussed Syria, and that was primarily the topic of conversation. Mr. Snow did not come up, beyond me saying that, re-emphasizing that where we have common interests, I think it's important for the two of us to work together. And on Syria, I said, listen, I don't expect us to agree on this issue of chemical weapons use. Although it is possible that after the UN inspector's report, it may be more difficult for Mr. Putin to maintain his current position about the evidence. But what I did say is that we both agree that the underlying conflict can only be resolved through a political transition as envisioned by the Geneva 1 and Geneva 2 process. And so we need to move forward together, even if the U.S. and Russia and other countries disagree on this specific issue of how to respond to chemical weapons use. It remains important for us to work together to try to urge all parties in the conflict to try to resolve it.
Okay, now that was a live press conference, and the president speaking live, and I'm listening to it at the same time you are doing this YouTube video. Let me just say the bottom line is, Putin said a few minutes ago, as we covered that live as well, that out of the 20 countries that were there, only 5 were for attacking Syria. And he named them. He said they're the United States of America, they are Saudi Arabia, they are France, they are Turkey, and they are Canada. Only 5 out of the 20 that are there. And so Putin is saying, look, I've even talked to the Pope, and the Pope is saying, don't do this. Matter of fact, the Pope is even calling for a vigil, a prayer, fasting, a day of prayer and fasting and vigil. So Putin even reached out to the Pope for some help. He mentioned Israel, and then what about Israel? I mean, the ramifications that could be on them. Obama is saying, look, I disagree. I think that the number of people that agreed attacking Syria, that I'm in the majority. But he didn't give us the countries. He didn't give us specifics. He just said, I think if you polled everybody in the room, I got the majority. And he's basically said the UN can't fix this. And so what's coming out of all of this is the United States and Russia are absolutely on the opposite ends of this decision. The world is divided and paralyzed. Nobody knows what to do until the 2 strongest superpowers in the world, and don't forget China, figure out what the plan is. I think Obama's going forward with a strike on Syria. We'll talk about it during my show today.
Alex Jones channel, the Alex Jones channel, you might want to check this out. He's saying there might be a false flag in Charleston, South Carolina, the next Pearl Harbor. I'll play a few seconds, but everyone that's watching my report might want to listen to this. This is like 27 minutes long, almost 28 minutes long. And I'm just reporting that he's reporting this. That's all I have to say. I'll play the first couple of seconds. I'm not playing the whole thing. You guys can go over to his channel. It was listed about 55 minutes ago. So it's like breaking news. Check this out.
Let's go to John, and then it's Ken up next. John is in Wyoming, retired nuke sub individual in the Navy. What is your take on the report I have that is accurate? This is a real source. That they nukes they didn't know were on the base were brought out, put on trucks by Special Forces, Army, and Air Force Base Dyess, and shipped out to South Carolina. What's your take on that? And then Graham saying brace for nuclear attack in South Carolina.
That's it. You guys go to the channel and listen to it. I really don't want to report on it. I'm just letting you know what's out there. Check it out. My goodness. Be prepared for anything, everybody.